Good morning. Thank you for your time today. We are always grateful to be able to connect with you all. My name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Before we get started, I wanted to point out that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function, so please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They'll answer your questions directly, and they'll also let me know of any questions that they think would be helpful for the entire group. I do also want to note that if they don't have time to answer your question immediately, or if you have to leave before you receive a response, then our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. So the plan for today is to give you all the tools you need to utilize checklists within CERVIS. We'll talk about what checklists are and how they're typically used. We'll look at setting up new checklist items and managing them on volunteer profiles. Then we'll cover setting restrictions on your events using checklists. And finally, we'll take a look at the options you have available for searching and reporting based on checklist items. So first, it's important to start by defining what a checklist item is. Now, there's a number of ways to track information about volunteers in CERVIS. And checklist items are unique in that they allow you to keep track of dated tasks or completed items on volunteer accounts. So instead of simply tracking whether or not something was completed or an item's status on a volunteer's profile, checklist items also allow you to indicate the date it will be due or the date it was completed, as well as the date it will expire, and then any additional notes for that particular item. So they add in that component of tracking the dates associated with those items. So let's talk about a couple examples of types of data that checklist items are good at collecting. So we're going to move into the checklist item inventory management section under the attribute management heading of the main dashboard. So when you click on that menu, this is where you can generate or create new checklist items. So we'll obviously go through that process. But I want to show you a couple examples that we have set up in my system currently. So one example I have right now is the idea of a volunteer orientation or a training. So mine's labeled annual volunteer safety training. And this is something that expires in my system on an annual basis. So every year my volunteers have to redo this training. And I use this to make sure that volunteers are up to date on our systems and schedules and things like that. So all of my events, or most of my events, have restrictions on them tied to this particular checklist item. So volunteers have to kind of keep that up to date. So the example here is the idea of an orientation or some kind of training or even like a certification that volunteers have to complete in order to sign up for particular sets of events. And again, this is a great example because I can track when it was completed, and I can also indicate when it's going to expire in this case because it's only valid for 1 year. And then again, this is tied to my events, so it sets restrictions on those events. So again, the example here is the idea of a training or some kind of orientation, or even the idea of like a certification. Below that is another example, and this one's titled TB tests. So this would be the case where a volunteer has to complete something like that, where they have to actually come in and have a TB test completed. Could also be in the vein of like a flu attestation, things like that. So the idea here, though, is the volunteer has to come in and have something done. And then this also, of course, has an expiration date associated with it. So this utilizes those dates very well in that case, too. Now, this is a good time to bring up the idea that checklist items are not something that volunteers can manage on their own. So a volunteer couldn't just come in here and say that they've had their TB test completed or it's up to date. This is something that my staff would have to mark on a volunteer account once that's been completed. So the third example I have here is called a volunteer intake form, and this is just like another form of documentation. The idea here is this is something that the volunteer has to take initiative on. So I might have a link to a document that they can download, or this could be something like a virtual training that a volunteer would attend, but the idea is that the volunteer is taking an action on their own, reporting that back to me or turning something into me, and then I can mark on their account that that's been completed. Now, there's already several places in CERVIS to track documentation. We have our terms and conditions, which would be like a digital waiver. We also have what we refer to as a liability waiver or a medical release, which would be more of that like physical signature. This would be in addition to those things. So maybe certain events require additional documentation that volunteers have to fill out. So this is just 3 quick examples. But again, the idea behind checklist items is a dated task. So something where you don't just want to know whether or not it was completed, but also when it was completed, or potentially when it's going to expire. So let's actually take a look at creating a new checklist item. That's done at the top of the page here. So there's 5 different fields that we have to look at, and the first is the name of the checklist item itself. This is something that would obviously identify or define what you're tracking, so this is pretty good to be very specific. This is not necessarily visible to volunteers, although it can be. But like I mentioned, volunteers do not have the ability to modify this information on their account. So this would be the name of the item you're tracking. Below that is a description. Again, this could be visible to volunteers. If you want to provide more information about what this checklist item is, this is generally helpful on the back end, more than for volunteers because, again, they can't track this on their own. But it could give a descriptor of what this particular item is or what's entailed or required to have this completed. So this is just additional information on top of the name. This is not a required field. Below that is this auto-assign option. This can be set to yes or no. This option determines if this checklist item is required for every single person who creates an account for you or creates an account with you. So for example, in my system, I have that safety training. Everybody has to do this in my console. I have this set to yes for auto-assign. That means that when a volunteer creates a profile in my system, by whatever means, whether they use the Quick Reg application or on-site or the full form application, when they create a profile, this is marked as assigned on their account, and it's given a due date based on what I have selected here. So for my safety training, in this example, the due date is 1 month out. But every time someone makes a new account, this is automatically assigned to their profile. It's considered due within 1 month. So this is useful, obviously, in this case, because everybody has to do this. In the case of the TB test, in my examples here, not everyone has to do this, and so I don't have this automatically assigned. This is for specific cases, for specific events or volunteers. So that's how I'd think about this. If you want everybody to have to do this checklist item, you can auto-assign it. Otherwise, you would leave that as no. The next item is the checklist item type, which is either private or public, and this determines whether or not volunteers can see this information on their profile. So again, if this is public, volunteers can see this data on their account. They can see the status of the checklist item, but they do not have permission to edit the information. They cannot change the status or add in notes or anything like that. All of those actions are only visible on the back end. So the private option here would mean that volunteers can't see the checklist item on their profile, but again, your staff can still manage the data. And then the last item here is the due date. Now this is actually kind of arbitrary. It's more of a metric for you. This is not something that would send out any automated notifications. This is a way for you to identify volunteers that have not yet completed something within a time frame that you would consider kind of the required time frame. So for example, with my safety training, I have that set to a due date of 1 month. So if a volunteer creates a profile, I expect them to complete a training or complete the training within 1 month. And if they don't, the system will automatically mark this checklist item as overdue on their account, which is something that I can search by. So again, that helps me find individuals that have not yet completed this item, maybe email those people specifically or kind of target them in that sense. Again, it's more of a metric for you. It's not going to trigger any notifications. All right, so that's how you generate a new checklist item. There's not very many fields there, and what that would do is produce a new item in this menu. Now, where you actually manage checklist items is on volunteer accounts themselves. So we're going to back out of this menu. We're going to go into the volunteer management section. Specifically, we're going to go to search and manage volunteer database. So in this menu, of course, you can search for an individual. You can search for them by name or leave that blank and view all your volunteers. If you have checklist items enabled in your system, you will see next to each person an option to manage checklist items for that person's account. So this is where you would go to manage those items on a volunteer profile. This is just a quick action to do that. This same action is also represented directly within the main menu of a volunteer. There is a line item for viewing or updating volunteer checklists. Either of those will take you to the same place. That would be this menu, which is again to manage checklist items for this particular person's account. So we can see in this case, all three of the checklist items are listed here. They're sorted by status, but we can see here that one of them is overdue, the intake form. This person never completed that. It was due back in May of last year, and he never actually got that turned in. If he did turn that in to me, I could go in and mark that as completed. Now that will add today's date as the date completed by default, but I could also manually pick something. So if I need to backlog this, like let's say, oh, he actually did get this back to me in May, I could go in here and backlog that information if I wanted to. You can also add expiration dates. So in this case, the intake form, that's just a document. I don't need this to expire, but if I did, I could say, let's say this has to expire within 1 year. I could go and change that date and add that in here. So the expiration date automatically switches the status of this checklist item to expired whenever that passes. And again, that's something you can search by. So you could find volunteers who have an expired checklist item or have it expired within a certain time frame. We'll look at the searching options here in a minute. So that's the expiration date, but again, you could leave this blank. And in this case, of course, I would leave that blank. The last thing is the notes. If you want to add more information about this, like he completed all the forms, or maybe he was missing one form or something like that, I could add notes in here. These are visible on the back end, and I can also report on this data. But again, it's not something that volunteers would really be engaging with. So that's how you would update one individual item. Just go through and change those options. At the bottom of the page is the option to update your volunteer checklists, and that'll just implement any changes that you've written in this particular instance. So those options can also be updated in bulk. There's a line item here at the bottom of the page that says display bulk update options. And in here, you can change any of those fields that we just looked at for multiple checklist items at one time. So if somebody just completed all three of these checklist items on the same date, I could go in and do a bulk update for that instead of changing them one at a time. This bulk update is based on the checkboxes to the right of each line item. So it will only do a bulk update to the items that you have selected. All right, so this is updating information on a volunteer's account for a particular checklist item. I do want to note that you can remove these. So if you need to go through and say, this person needs to redo this, or this was assigned an error, you can remove checklist items, and that will clear out that entire field. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is actually setting restrictions on events using checklist items, and then we'll come back here and look at searching for volunteers based on checklist items, which will lead into reporting as well. So obviously, one of the main uses of checklist items is to be able to set restrictions on your events based on certain things that volunteers have to have completed in order to sign up. So that's done when you're either creating a new event or if you're updating an existing event. Let's go ahead and look at Add New Event under the Event or Project Management heading. Towards the bottom of the page is where you'll find all of the restriction options. And one of these sections is for checklist items specifically. So we can see that here in my system. I have my 3 checklist items relayed here. And if I want to set these as restrictions, I would choose whichever are required. The way that restrictions work in Service is that they're positive restrictions, meaning you choose who is permitted to register. You don't choose who is prevented from registering. So in my case, if I needed everybody to have completed all 3 of these items in order to sign up for this event, I would just select the boxes next to those 3 checklist items. And then importantly, on the left-hand side, there's a dialog to say that only volunteers with any or all of the selected checklist items are able to register for this event. And in this case, I would need to switch that to all. That means that someone has to have all 3 of these completed on their profile. None of them can be expired in order for them to sign up for this event. If I had left that as any, volunteers would only need one of these 3 things, and that would consider the requirement fulfilled. So in my case, I would choose that all option, and they'd have to have all 3 of these things done in order to sign up for this event. So this is where you set restrictions on your events, and again, that can be done retroactively as well. So if you need to update an existing event with a new checklist item you've added, you can do that. All right, so that's setting restrictions. The next thing is searching for volunteers by your checklist items, and then we'll take a look at reporting options that come along with that. So As with most searching options for the volunteer database side, this is found in the Advanced Volunteer Search. So under Volunteer Management, click on Advanced Volunteer Search. That will take you to this menu. And in here, there is a specific line item for volunteer checklist options. So we can see there's two main search functions here. One is to find volunteers whose particular checklist item is or was due, completed, overdue, expired, or not assigned. This can also have a date range associated with it. So for example, I could find people whose annual safety training is currently expired, or I could find people whose annual safety training expired between certain dates. So maybe just people who expired this month so far. So you can apply a date range here if you want to, but you don't have to. And again, this just helps me to find that subset of individuals. I could also find people based on, if it's overdue, and that's based on that due date that you assign when you create the checklist item. But I could go in and search by any of those items, and then of course, email that list of volunteers. I could also export that information or do a bulk update, different things like that. The other search function is directly below that. It says to find volunteers whose checklist item, and again, you select a particular one. And then the option here is to find a checklist item that has a completed date that's greater than a certain number of months old. This is kind of another way to search by like the expired mechanic, except that it is based on the completed date. So if you had a checklist item where you had neglected to or forgot to input an expiration date for some time or for a certain period, you just want to find people whose completed item is over a certain number of months old. Let's say over 5 years old for the TB test. This would then find anybody whose TB test was over 5 years old, regardless if I had forgotten to or if I had chosen to include an expiration date when I entered that information originally. So just another way to search by that information, and it's based on the completed date. So as with any search on this page, you just input the fields you'd like to do. These can be combined with any other search as well. So if you want to find, for example, volunteers who made a new account between certain dates and also have not completed their safety training, right? You could combine those metrics to find a more specific set of volunteers. And when you're ready, just click on Search Volunteer Database at the top or bottom of the page. Now, when you run that search, of course, it's going to display your results. And then there's a number of things that you can do with that. I could email these individuals. I could also print out a spreadsheet if I wanted to export that information. Now, this spreadsheet tool is a data export, but this does not include checklist items. We're going to talk about that report specifically here in a moment. This just includes their other account information. There's two default spreadsheets, a basic contact info and a full spreadsheet, which would be all their account info. But you can also create a custom spreadsheet if you need to export data in a particular format. So let's look at the other reporting options though. So we're going to go back to the main dashboard, and then we're going to go into Report Management under the Volunteer Management heading. So Report Management is where all of your reporting options are found that include hours information. And there's two reports here that I want to focus on. The first one is Custom Participation Report. This is a highly useful report. It's very flexible, and this can be run based on previous searches. So again, if we just searched for all the volunteers who have not completed or have completed a certain checklist item, I could use that query to drive this report and produce hours based on that information. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just wanted to mention that functionality. The other report that I want to show is number 8. So if we scroll down, there is another report called Checklist Status Report. And this one is also a spreadsheet only. It does not use the date range because this report does not relay hours information. This report is a way to export your checklist item information. So you can see with this report, we do have that same query option. So I could run this for just my previous search if I only want to view a specific set of volunteers. Or of course, I could run this for all the volunteers in my database. There are 3 detail levels in this report. We'll talk about these in a moment here, but they just reflect or change how much info from the checklist items are relayed in the report. And then below that, you have your options for this report, which is selecting how much data you want to include from your volunteer profiles in this export. So you can include as much of their account information as you want to. This includes things like custom fields. But then you can see above that we can pick which checklist items I want to include in the report. So I'm going to go ahead and run this in high detail to show you what this looks like. This report, again, is a CSV file. It's a spreadsheet. And we can see here that every row in this report represents one person in my database. And every column represents the data that I chose to include. So I have their names, of course, and then I have the checklist items. And there's multiple sections because I chose 3 different checklist items. But we have the name of the checklist item itself. We have its status, the due date, date completed, the expiration date if there is one, and then also notes. So since I ran this report in high detail, I'm getting all of the information from checklists that there is to gather. So all of the data that we have is being pulled in that case. If you don't need as much information, you can run it in one of the other 2 detail levels. Medium would just cut off a couple of the fields. We're basically just receiving, in this case, the checklist item itself, the name, the status, the due date, and the date completed. So in this case, we don't have the expiration date and we don't have the notes. The low detail version of this report would cut it off even further. We'd basically remove all the dates, and what we'd get is just the checklist item and the status itself. So I'll run that briefly too. So again, in this case, all we're seeing here is the volunteer's name, because I chose to include that, each checklist item that I selected, and its status. We don't have any dates or notes associated with those items. So that's what those 3 detail levels do. But again, this is a way for you to export that information out of Service. And then, of course, this is a plain CSV file. I can sort it by whatever column I want to. I can group things together or pull the information out in different ways. And once again, I only chose to include volunteer name here. But this report could include any other account information from your volunteers. So we could have their name, phone, email, we could have their age or their address or emergency contact info, whatever other kind of data I need to pull from their account. All right, so today we talked about what are checklist items and a few examples. We looked at creating and managing checklist items on volunteer accounts, and then we looked at setting restrictions and searching based on those items. And then lastly, we looked at reporting based on checklist item searches, and then also how to run that checklist item report. So our team has been answering questions throughout the call, but I will be taking questions from the larger group as they continue to come in. So please feel free to continue writing in your questions, and then we'll try to address some of those to the larger group here as well. All right, so we got a question about performing bulk updates on checklist items, and I neglected to mention that, so I'm glad that was asked. You certainly can bulk update this information for multiple volunteer accounts at the same time. So a good example of that would be, let's say your volunteers have attended an orientation, and you actually had that listed as an event in Service. So I, for example, have this new volunteer orientation in my system. If we go into view the registered volunteers, from this menu, I can select those individuals, and then I can choose to manage their accounts. Basically what this does is it runs a search for this set of volunteers. So that takes us back to the volunteer search management dashboard. And from here, I can do a bulk update. I could also go and run a search through the advanced volunteer search if I wanted to go that route. And in fact, those events are listed in there, so I could, pick out the attendees from that event. But let's say all these people completed my orientation, so I want to bulk update that item on their profile. I can then select these volunteers, and then at the bottom of the page or at the top of the page, you'll see bulk update. And then when you do a bulk update on volunteer accounts, you're not going to be updating everything, because usually you obviously would not want to do that. So in this case, we're just going to select exactly what we want to do. Now, there's a lot of items on this page. I happen to see the checklist right away, but if you're not seeing something on this page, I've found that it's useful to use Find in Browser, which you can do with Control F or Command F, and then we could just search for the term checklist, and that'll help us find that item real quickly. I can go ahead and click on that, and then at the bottom of the page, click on Select Items to Bulk Update. And then from there, I choose which checklist item I want to update. I pick which status I want to give these people. I can add a due date in here, but again, this isn't going to really give me any information at this point because I'm already marking this as completed. So we could enter in today as the due date, and then we'll enter in today as the date completed. That will supersede the due date anyway, because this item is completed. Now, there's in this case, there is an expiration date in my system because I expire this on an annual basis. So I'll just enter that in as well. We can click on Update Volunteer Info. It's going to confirm that we want to change these pieces of information on those 6 volunteer accounts. And I can say yes, proceed, or no, cancel. So you'll always see this option when you're doing a bulk update, just to make sure you do want to carry out those types of changes. We can go ahead and do that. Now, if we look at any of these volunteer profiles, if I go into Manage Their Checklist Items, we'll see that they've been marked as completed for this training. We have the date completed and expiration date as we listed out. All right, that's a great question. So another question came in. Why is due date a required field, and does anything automatically happen in Service if a checklist item is overdue? That's a good question. I did mention this, but let's reiterate. So the due date is more of a metric for you. It does not automatically trigger any sort of notification to volunteers or to staff. It's something you can search by. So again, in the advanced volunteer search menu, in the checklist items section, you can search for items that are overdue specifically. So that would allow you to find volunteers who have not completed something. But beyond the checklist item being changed from due to overdue, once the due date passes, the due date doesn't trigger anything else to happen. So no emails are going out. It's basically just switching that to a status that you can then search by. So yeah, generally I think of the due date on a checklist item as a metric for you. If you want people to complete something within 2 weeks, make that your due date, and then you can search by that criteria. But it's not going to trigger any sort of notification to volunteers or any notification to your staff. So a good question came in about using my example for the idea of like a training that volunteers would have to complete. And how volunteers could get that type of information, right? So if those would be directly available to them, or if you could make them available in Service for volunteers to complete. So we don't have any sort of module for volunteers to complete a training directly within the system. The best way to handle that would be to send that to volunteers via a direct link. So if that's some kind of documentation that a volunteer needs to download and review, or like a PowerPoint they have to go through, or if you have like a YouTube video that they have to watch as a part of that training, if it's like a virtual training, the best way to include that type of information depends on kind of the requirement of that training. So let's walk through a couple examples. If you have a training that every person in your system has to complete, then a really nice way to handle that is actually to include that in the confirmation email when a volunteer creates a new profile. So regardless what someone has done, whether they're signing up for a new event or they're just creating a profile, you can have a profile creation confirmation message sent to your volunteers that's edited in the system configuration in the email message content section. So that, again, is referred to specifically as a profile creation confirmation message. So that email is found in here, and it basically is a way for you to have a notification go out to volunteers directly as soon as they create their account. And you can write all the information into this email. There are a couple variables in here, and I do want to mention, just while we're on the topic, variables in Service will be listed in the information box wherever they're applicable. So you can't just copy and paste these anywhere. But you can see in this email, this is just a bare bones email that goes out when someone makes a new account. If I have a training or orientation that someone has to complete, regardless what they're going to do, if they have to do that as soon as they create their account, this is where I would link to that. So I would just send that out in this email, link to that documentation or link to that video or whatever it is. If it's something that you need volunteers to download as like a document, as opposed to viewing it online, then what you could do is you could actually host that in Service and then just link to it in here. So where you would upload a document is under the main dashboard, under System Management. There is a File Management section. In here, you can attach a document to your system, and that'll produce this direct file link. You can grab that link, copy it out, and then if we go back to that email section, so again, system configuration, email message content, and I'm going to scroll down to the profile creation confirmation message. I could have that document basically listed in here. So I could say like, click here to download the training material, something like that. And then I could turn this into a hyperlink using this insert edit link option here, and then just paste that URL that I copied out of the system into this section. So that basically just produces a download link. It's not an attachment in the email, but it's a direct download that they can follow when they get this confirmation email. So this is a nice way, again, if everybody has to complete this training, then you can just paste that right in here. If this is unique to particular events, I would just change where that's linked. So instead of doing this in the profile creation confirmation message, I would do it specifically on the event itself, whether that's in the description section if they have to do it before they sign up, or if you include that in like the additional information for the confirmation message, if it's something that they have to do after they have registered. So it just kind of depends on what your workflow is. But again, I would link to those documents or link to those videos in one of those places depending on what your workflow is. All right, so question was asked about how to create those restrictions again. So let's take a look at that. We're actually already in the Add New Event menu, but I want to show you this from the beginning. So if we go in under the Event or Project Management heading to Add New Event, and again, you can also do this for existing events. So you can update this on events that already exist in your system. But if you go to Add New Event, about partway down the page here, you'll find the restrictions section. So you can restrict using a number of different fields in Service. Checklist items is just one of those options. And I'll reiterate too that the way that restrictions work in Service is that they are positive restrictions, meaning you choose who is permitted to register. The default state for a new event is that there are no restrictions. Nothing is selected, meaning there are no restrictions. Anybody can sign up. If you want to restrict registration, you select a specific item. So in this case, we'll talk about checklist items. Let's say I have my safety training. Everybody has to do that for this event, but I don't have other restrictions. Then I would only choose that one. And then this item would have to be marked as completed on a volunteer account in order for that person to register for this event. So volunteers could see the event unless I choose to limit visibility. There's an option to do that. But volunteers could see the event, and as long as they have this option marked as completed on their account, then they could also register. So that item getting marked as completed has to be done by someone on staff. The volunteer cannot do that themselves. So that kind of requires a positive action on your end. But then once that's been marked, they'd be able to sign up for this event. If they're not approved, if they don't have that completed, so if it's expired, if it's just marked as due, if it's marked as overdue, if it's marked as not assigned, any of those things, then they would not be able to register for this event. And you could have multiple restrictions. You could select multiple items. And again, that's where this any or all dialog comes in. If you leave this as any, they only have to have one of these three things in this case on their profile. If I switch this to all, they have to have all three of those things completed on their account. So I think we've covered all the questions that would be good for the larger group. You can continue to ask questions. We'll leave this open for a little bit longer. All right, thank you for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and shut down the webinar. But if you do have further questions about this topic or anything else, please feel free to reach out to our customer support team using the Need Help button when you're logged in. You can type in a topic and find articles related to that. And you can always click on Contact Us at the bottom to submit a support request as well. Thanks for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your Friday.